The sun bleeds into the horizon over the Gobi Desert, transforming endless dunes into waves of amber and rust. As twilight descends, the temperature plummets 40 degrees in less than an hour. The wind dies completely. What follows is a silence so absolute that your own heartbeat becomes deafening. This is when the ancient fear awakens, when nomadic herders seal their doors and refuse to look toward the empty places between the dunes. They know something that outsiders dismiss as superstition. They know that in the most desolate corners of this wilderness, something impossibly old waits beneath the sand. The Gobi stretches across 500,000 square miles of southern Mongolia and northern China. It is one of Earth's harshest environments, where summer temperatures soar past 120 degrees and winter nights freeze to -40. Nothing should survive here, and yet the desert pulses with whispered warnings about a creature so terrifying that many locals will not speak its name aloud. They call it the death worm, the Olgoi-Khorkhoi, the intestine worm, a name that itself carries the weight of generations who learned too late that some legends are warnings written in blood. What if the most remote desert on Earth conceals a predator so lethal that it has evaded scientific documentation, not through absence, but through lethality? What if every expedition that got too close simply never returned to tell the tale? These are not comfortable questions, but they are necessary ones when confronted with the testimonies we are about to explore. Deep in the crimson expanse of the Gobi Desert, where sand meets sky in an endless expanse of desolation, Mongolian herders still refuse to speak certain names aloud during the heat of summer. The old taboos persist, passed down through countless generations of nomadic families who have learned that some knowledge carries a price. Among these forbidden subjects, none inspires more dread than the creature they call Olgoi-Khorkhoi, a name that translates directly to intestine worm, though this translation fails to capture the visceral terror embedded in those syllables when whispered around dying campfire. The creature exists at the intersection of legend and lived experience in Mongolia, a place where oral tradition has preserved stories with remarkable consistency across centuries. Elders describe the Olgoi-Khorkhoi with such precise detail that their accounts create an almost photographic image in the listener's mind. Blood red in color, resembling the intestines of cattle in both hue and texture. The worm is said to be as thick as a man's arm and spans anywhere from 2 to 5 feet in length. Unlike earthworms or other familiar creatures, this organism possesses no discernible head or tail, appearing identical at both ends, a biological anomaly that adds to its otherworldly nature. Those who claim knowledge of the creature insist it dwells exclusively in the most inhospitable regions of the southern Gobi, specifically in areas where the gnarled saxaul trees manage to survive. These hardy plants, twisted and weather-beaten, serve as a kind of marker, a botanical warning sign that locals have learned to read. The saxaul grows where almost nothing else can, in soils so alkaline and harsh that even the hardy desert grasses surrender. It is precisely in these zones of maximum desolation, where the earth itself seems hostile to life, that the Olgoi-Khorkhoi makes its home. The cultural taboos surrounding this creature extend far beyond simple superstition. Mongolian tradition dictates specific months when speaking of the worm becomes particularly dangerous, primarily during the hottest period of summer, from June through July, when the creature is believed to be most active. During these weeks, nomadic families traveling through suspected worm territory will go to extraordinary lengths to avoid even oblique references to the beast. Children are taught from an early age to use euphemisms and coded language. If one must reference the creature at all, indirect phrases are employed, speaking instead of the thing that dwells beneath or the red danger. Even more striking is the prohibition against visual representation. Drawing or sketching the Olgoi-Khorkhoi is considered profoundly dangerous, an act that might attract the creature's attention or somehow summon its presence. This taboo has created a fascinating documentary gap. While Mongolian art and craft traditions feature elaborate depictions of dragons, birds, and other creatures both real and mythical, the intestine worm remains conspicuously absent from their visual culture. The few illustrations that do exist were typically created by outsiders, foreign visitors who either didn't know or didn't respect the traditional warnings. Local artists who possessed the skill to render the creature in paint or ink steadfastly refused to do so, even when offered substantial payment. The methods of killing attributed to the Olgoi-Khorkhoi elevated beyond a mere dangerous animal into something approaching supernatural menace. According to widespread accounts, the creature can kill at a distance without physically touching its victim. Some versions of the legend describe an electrical discharge, a bolt of energy that can drop a horse and rider instantly. Other accounts speak of a poison so potent that it kills on contact, sprayed from the worm's body or projected through the sand itself. These descriptions vary in specifics, but remain consistent in their core claim that the creature possesses lethal capabilities beyond those of ordinary desert fauna. The stories tell of herders who stumbled upon the worm's territory and died where they stood, their bodies discovered days later with no visible wounds, their faces frozen in expressions of final agony. Livestock are said to die in groups when a worm passes beneath their grazing area, dropping suddenly as if struck by lightning. Camel caravans have allegedly been forced to abandon entire trade routes after multiple unexplained deaths clustered in particular valleys and ravines. These accounts, whether factual or embellished, have had measurable real-world consequences on how people navigate and settle the Gobi region. Into this landscape of ancient belief and persistent fear came Roy Chapman Andrews in 1926, an American explorer and naturalist who would later serve as director of the American Museum of Natural History. Andrews arrived in Mongolia leading a well-funded expedition with multiple objectives, including the search for dinosaur fossils and the documentation of unknown species. A man of science and skepticism, he approached the Mongolian legends with the bemused tolerance typical of Western academics of his era. The Olgoi-Khorkhoi represented to him exactly the kind of colorful local folklore that added exotic flavor to expedition accounts, but held no zoological validity. What Andrews did not anticipate was the absolute conviction with which his Mongolian guides and contacts insisted on the creature's existence. These were not wide-eyed villagers sharing ghost stories, but practical men who navigated the desert for their livelihood, individuals whose survival depended on accurate knowledge of their environment. When Andrews inquired about the intestine worm, expecting vague second-hand tales, he instead encountered detailed testimonies from people who claimed direct encounters or knew reliable witnesses who had seen the creature firsthand. His guide, a man who had spent his entire life traversing the Gobi, became visibly agitated when Andrews expressed doubt. The guide insisted he had personally witnessed the aftermath of an Olgoi-Khorkhoi killing, describing a scene where 3 sheep lay dead in a tight cluster with no marks upon them, and the distinctive tracks in the sand nearby. Tracks unlike those of any snake or lizard, showing the passage of something that moved by rippling its entire body in wave-like contractions. The guide's adamant certainty, his willingness to stake his reputation on the truth of these claims, gave Andrews pause, though not enough to fully convert his skepticism. Throughout his time in Mongolia, Andrews collected numerous accounts. A lama at a remote monastery told him that the worm's appearances followed predictable patterns, emerging after rare desert rains when the sand became slightly more workable. Another informant, a trader who had crossed the Gobi dozens of times, showed Andrews a map with specific regions marked as worm territory, areas he meticulously avoided regardless of how much time the detour added to his journey. The consistency of these accounts, coming from sources with no apparent connection to one another, troubled Andrews' scientific certainty more than he cared to admit in his published writings. What struck Andrews most forcefully was the way these beliefs shaped material reality. This was not abstract superstition confined to campfire stories. Settlement patterns across vast stretches of the southern Gobi showed clear avoidance of certain areas, regions that possessed adequate water and grazing, but remained stubbornly unpopulated. Trade routes took inexplicable detours, adding days to journeys for no apparent geographic or political reason. When pressed, caravan leaders would explain that these paths avoided worm zones, and no amount of potential profit could convince them to risk the more direct route. The economic impact of these beliefs extended across generations. Families that had herded in certain regions for centuries would suddenly abandon traditional grazing lands if rumors circulated of worm sightings. These were not decisions made lightly. Nomadic Mongolians possessed intimate knowledge of their territories, understanding which valleys offered the best spring grasses, which wells remained reliable through droughts, which rock formations provided shelter from winter storms. To abandon such carefully accumulated geographical wisdom required extraordinary motivation. The threat of the Olgoi-Khorkhoi apparently provided sufficient reason. Andrews documented how entire communities shared a kind of collective agreement about the worm's habits and habitats. Children absorbed this information as naturally as they learned which plants were edible and which snakes were venomous. Young herders could point to distant ridgelines and identify specific draws and washes, considered dangerous, knowledge transmitted through stories, warnings, and the observed behavior of their elders. This information formed part of the essential survival curriculum, equally important as knowing how to track water or predict weather. The psychological dimension of the Olgoi-Khorkhoi legend reveals something profound about how isolated communities process danger and uncertainty. The Gobi Desert presents genuine lethal threats, from extreme temperature fluctuations to water scarcity to poisonous creatures. In an environment where death can arrive suddenly and often without clear explanation, the intestine worm serves as a repository for ambient fear, a concrete form given to the abstract anxiety of desert existence. To name the danger, to describe it in specific terms, provides an illusion of control in an uncontrollable environment. Yet dismissing the Olgoi-Khorkhoi as mere psychological projection ignores the stubborn specificity of the accounts. If this were simply generalized fear given form, one might expect the legends to vary wildly from region to region, family to family. Instead, the descriptions maintain remarkable consistency across hundreds of miles and disparate communities. The blood-red color, the thickness, the association with Saxol trees, the summer activity period, these details repeat with an almost documentary precision that suggests either a shared factual basis or a culturally preserved narrative of extraordinary stability. Modern cryptozoologists, and those who study unknown species, point to other creatures once dismissed as folklore that later proved zoologically real. The mountain gorilla, the giant squid, the megamouth shark, all existed in indigenous knowledge systems long before Western science acknowledged them. The Gobi Desert remains one of the least explored regions on Earth. Vast stretches where human presence is measured in persons per 100 square miles rather than per square mile. That unknown species might persist in such an environment is not scientifically implausible. Whether the Olgoi-Khorkhoi exists as a physical creature or as a powerful cultural construct, its impact on Mongolian life remains undeniable. The legend has survived waves of political upheaval, from the collapse of the Qing dynasty through Soviet influence and into the modern era. Each generation inherits the warnings and passes them forward, maintaining traditions that predate written history in the region. In the vastness of the Gobi, where sandstorms erase tracks and the horizon stretches beyond sight, the intestine worm continues its reign over certain territories, honored through absence, respected through silence, and feared with the kind of ancient persistence that suggests truth may wear many forms, some of which resist easy categorization. The Gobi Desert keeps its secrets well. Sand shifts, wind erases, and time buries evidence deeper than any archaeologist would dare to dig. But in the spring of 1979, Soviet geologist Yegor Loginov stumbled into a secret the desert didn't want found. And what he witnessed would haunt the margins of classified documents for nearly 4 decades before the truth began to surface. Loginov was not a man prone to fantasy. His colleagues described him as methodical, rational to a fault, the kind of scientist who triple-checked his measurements and scoffed at superstition. He had spent 15 years mapping mineral deposits across the Soviet Union's most inhospitable territories, from the frozen wastes of Siberia to the volcanic badlands of Kamchatka. The southern Gobi, with its relentless sun and endless dunes, was just another assignment, another data point in the grand geological survey of the Mongolian People's Republic. His team of 6 arrived at their designated survey site, approximately 80 kilometers northwest of the Chinese border, on April 14, 1979. The location had been selected based on preliminary satellite imagery, suggesting unusual mineral concentrations beneath the surface. Standard procedure. Routine. Science. Nothing about those first 3 days suggested what was coming. The team established their camp, assembled their drilling equipment, and began the tedious work of core sampling. Temperatures climbed above 40 degrees Celsius by midday. Sand infiltrated everything: their food, their water, their sleeping bags. But this was expected. This was the Gobi. What wasn't expected was what happened on the morning of April 17. Loginov's field journal, now part of the recently declassified archive, describes the morning as unnaturally still. No wind, no animal sounds. Even the flies that had plagued them for days had vanished. The air felt heavy, he wrote, like the atmosphere before a thunderstorm, except the sky remained cloudless, a pale, washed-out blue that hurt to look at. His team powered up their primary drilling rig at 7:30 in the morning. The machine had functioned flawlessly for 3 days. It was well-maintained Soviet engineering, built to withstand extreme condition. Yet within minutes of starting the drill, the engine began to sputter. Diagnostics showed nothing wrong. Fuel levels were fine. Oil pressure normal. But the machine refused to maintain consistent power, surging and dying, as if fighting against some invisible resistance. Then the instruments began to fail. The electromagnetic survey equipment, crucial for mapping subsurface mineral deposits, started displaying readings that made no sense. Loginov described watching the needles on his magnetometer swing wildly, pegging at maximum deflection before dropping to zero, then spiking again. Digital readouts flickered between numbers too extreme to be real. Magnetic field fluctuations of the magnitude his instruments were recording should have required massive deposits of ferromagnetic ore directly beneath their feet, or possibly seismic activity. But there had been no earthquakes, and preliminary surveys had shown nothing unusual in the mineral composition. His team checked connections, replaced batteries, swapped out equipment. Nothing helped. Every instrument designed to measure electromagnetic fields was registering what Loginov called impossible anomalies. And then the animals began to die. They had brought 4 camels with them, sturdy Bactrian beasts accustomed to the harsh desert conditions. 2 were tethered near the main camp. The others kept about 50 meters away near the equipment storage. At approximately 9:15 in the morning, one of the team members, a junior geologist named Viktor Sokolov, shouted for Loginov. The 2 camels near the equipment had collapsed. Loginov ran to them, expecting heat exhaustion or perhaps some toxic plant they had managed to ingest. What he found defied explanation. Both animals were dead. Not dying, not suffering, but already gone. Their bodies showed no external injuries, no wounds, no signs of struggle. No foam at the mouth that might indicate poisoning. No swelling, no discoloration. Loginov, who had veterinary training from his years working in remote areas, examined them thoroughly. Their eyes were open, filmed over, but showing no hemorrhaging. Their mouths hung slack. When he placed his hand near their nostrils, he felt no breath, no warmth. The bodies were already cooling in the morning heat, which struck him as strange. It took time for a large animal to cool, even in the Gobi. These camels had gone from living to room temperature far faster than biology should allow. And there was something else, a smell. Loginov described it as acrid, almost metallic, with an underlying note of decay that reminded him of battery acid mixed with rotting vegetation. It hung in the air around the dead animals, strong enough to make his eyes water. None of his team had smelled anything like it before. It didn't match any known chemical they had brought with them, any fuel or solvent or cleaning agent. The smell simply existed, sourceless and disturbing, clinging to the scene like an invisible fog. They were still examining the camels when the sand began to move. At first, Loginov thought it was wind, a localized dust devil forming nearby. But there was still no wind. The air remained dead calm, heavy with that pre-storm pressure that made breathing feel labored. Yet 50 meters to the east, a line of sand was rising, falling, shifting in a way that suggested something massive moving beneath the surface, not something burrowing. Loginov was adamant about this distinction in his report. Burrowing creatures displaced sand gradually, creating tunnels, leaving tracks. This was different. The sand moved as if something was pushing it aside, the way water parts before the bow of a ship. A raised ridge of disturbed earth traced a path through the desert floor at a speed that seemed impossible for anything moving underground. Loginov grabbed his binoculars and focused on the disturbance. The tubular shape beneath the sand, whatever it was, appeared to be at least 10 meters long, perhaps longer. It was difficult to judge because he could only see where the sand was being displaced, not the thing itself. The shape moved in a straight line at first, then curved sharply, then straightened again, traveling at what he estimated was 30 to 40 kilometers per hour. Nothing he knew of could move that fast beneath loose sand. Certainly no known reptile or mammal. The mechanical efficiency required, the power to displace that much material at that speed without surfacing, without slowing, it violated everything he understood about physics and biology. The trail it left behind was clearly visible, a raised scar of disturbed earth stretching across the desert floor. Loginov watched it move for nearly 2 minutes, tracking south and then east, before it simply stopped. The sand settled. The ridge flattened. Whatever had been there was gone, as if it had never existed. But the evidence remained, that long line of displaced earth, still warm to the touch when Loginov and Sokolov walked its length later that afternoon. The team wanted to leave immediately. Loginov recorded their growing panic in his journal. These were experienced field scientists, men who had worked in isolation and danger before, but this was different. This was incomprehensible. The equipment failures could be explained, perhaps. Some freak magnetic anomaly, a buried deposit of magnetite creating localized field distortions. The dead camels were harder to rationalize, but not impossible. Desert animals sometimes died suddenly, cardiac events, unknown toxins, the stress of extreme heat. But the thing beneath the sand, that purposeful, swift movement, that tubular presence that defied every natural law they knew, that broke them. Loginov made the decision to stay for another 6 hours. He needed documentation, measurements, samples. They photographed the disturbed earth trail. They took soil samples from multiple points along its length. They measured residual electromagnetic readings, which remained elevated but were gradually returning to normal. And they examined their equipment, finding damage that couldn't be easily explained. Several metal components showed signs of corrosion that looked like acid burns. The drill bit itself, which had barely penetrated a meter into the ground, was pitted and scarred, as if exposed to some caustic substance. The plastic housing on one of the magnetometers had partially melted, deformed in a way that suggested intense, localized heat, yet there had been no fire, no obvious heat source. The smell lingered for hours. Loginov noted that it seemed to concentrate in certain areas, particularly near the equipment and along the trail of disturbed sand. By late afternoon, it had faded to the point where it was barely detectable, but that faint, acrid trace remained, coating the back of his throat, making water taste metallic. They broke camp at 1600 hours and began the long drive back to the regional administrative center in Dalanzadgad. Loginov spent the journey composing his official report in his head, knowing how insane it would sound, knowing that his reputation as a serious scientist would be questioned. But he had witnesses. 5 other men had seen what he had seen. They had data, photographs, physical samples. The truth was the truth, no matter how strange. His official report, filed on April 23, 1979, was 47 pages long. It included detailed descriptions of the electromagnetic anomalies, the equipment malfunctions, the unexplained animal deaths, and yes, the movement beneath the sand. Loginov was careful to avoid speculation. He reported only what he had observed, what could be measured and documented. He made no claims about what the tubular shape might have been, offering no theories about unknown animals or geological phenomena. He simply stated the facts as he had witnessed them and requested a follow-up expedition with more sophisticated equipment. The report was received, stamped, filed, and according to official records, lost. For 38 years, Yegor Loginov's account existed only in his own memory and in the whispered conversations of colleagues who had heard the story secondhand. Requests to access the original documents were denied or ignored. The survey site was placed off limits for reasons never officially explained. Loginov himself continued his career, but he never returned to the Gobi, never spoke publicly about what he had seen, and retired in 1994 with his silence intact. It was only in 2017, during a broader declassification initiative, following the collapse of administrative protocols from the Soviet era, that Loginov's report resurfaced. Researchers combing through newly released material found it misfiled under geological surveys of the Ural Mountains, thousands of kilometers from where it belonged. The report was complete, including photographs that showed the trail of disturbed sand, images of the corroded equipment, and documentation of the electromagnetic readings that had defied explanation. Yegor Loginov had died in 2009, taking whatever additional details he remembered to his grave. But his words remain precise and unsettling, a window into an event that still has no satisfactory explanation. The Gobi keeps its secrets, and sometimes those secrets move beneath the sand at impossible speeds, leaving only questions and the faint smell of acid on the wind. The Gobi Desert holds its secrets beneath windswept sands and beneath the vast dome of stars that wheel overhead each night. In 1972, one family's encounter would leave scars that no amount of time could fully heal. Scars both visible and invisible, burned into flesh and memory alike. The Batsai-Khan clan had followed the ancient rhythms of nomadic life for generations, moving their herds across traditional grazing routes that their ancestors had walked for centuries. They knew every water source, every sheltered valley, every patch of scrub grass that could sustain their sheep and goats through the harsh seasons. The summer grazing grounds near the Sèvres Depression had always been particularly favored by the family. The grassland there grew thick enough to fatten the livestock before the long winter, and the location offered protection from the worst of the desert winds. But after one terrifying night in late July of 1972, the Batsai-Khan family would never return to those grounds again. They would abandon pastures their family had used for over 100 years, and no amount of persuasion from neighboring families could convince them to reconsider. The story they told was one that would have been dismissed entirely as superstition or nightmare, were it not for the physical evidence that remained: the scars, the tracks, the testimony of multiple witnesses who had no reason to fabricate such a bizarre account. The family's story was recorded almost by accident, preserved by Dr. Elena Vasilyeva, a Soviet anthropologist from Leningrad who had been conducting fieldwork among the nomadic communities of southern Mongolia. Dr. Vasilyeva had been staying with a family nearly 40 kilometers from the Batsai-Khan camp, documenting traditional herding practices and recording oral histories. She had heard rumors of a family that had suddenly relocated, abandoning their summer grounds under mysterious circumstances, but she initially paid little attention to what she assumed was simply another folk tale. It was only when she encountered the Batsai-Khan family at a local trading post that her academic curiosity was piqued. The mother, a woman named Oyuna, was selling off several sheep at prices well below market value, eager to complete the transaction quickly and move on. Dr. Vasilyeva noticed the family's eldest son, a young man of 19 named Dorjaren, keeping his hands buried deep in his pockets despite the summer heat. When he finally withdrew them to help load supplies onto their truck, the anthropologist caught a glimpse of the scarring that covered both palms and extended up his forearms. The patterns were unlike anything she had seen before, strange branching marks that resembled frost patterns on a winter window, the distinctive signature of severe electrical burns. Her scientific training overriding her initial skepticism, Dr. Vasilyeva asked if she might record their story. The family was reluctant at first, fearing ridicule, but the anthropologist's genuine interest and professional demeanor eventually won their trust. Over the course of 3 interviews conducted in late August and early September of 1972, she documented their account in meticulous detail, recording their words on magnetic tape and photographing Dorjaren's injuries. Oyuna, the mother, described awakening in the deep hours of the night, that darkest time before dawn when the world seems suspended between one day and the next. At first, she could not identify what had pulled her from sleep. There was no sound of distressed animals, no wind battering the felt walls of their jur, no crying child. Just a profound wrongness that raised the hair on her arms and sent ice water trickling down her spine. The livestock, she realized, had gone completely silent. This detail disturbed her more than any amount of noise could have. Anyone who has lived with herds knows that animals are never truly quiet. There are always sounds in the night, The shuffle of hooves, the occasional bleat or grunt, the rustle of movement. But now there was nothing. An absolute silence that seemed to press against her eardrums like physical pressure. She rose from her sleeping pallet, careful not to wake her husband or younger children, and moved to the door of the jur. What she saw when she pulled back the felt flap would remain burned into her memory for the rest of her life. The sheep and goats stood in the pen, but they were motionless, as still as carved statues. Their eyes were open, reflecting the starlight, but they did not move. They did not even appear to be breathing. It was as if time itself had stopped, freezing the animals in place. But it was the glow that truly terrified her. Approximately 30 meters from their jur, the sand itself seemed to be emanating light. It was not the warm glow of fire, nor the steady beam of an electric torch. Oyuna described it as a phosphorescent quality, a cold greenish-blue radiance that seemed to pulse with a rhythm that reminded her of breathing. The light was brightest at the center, near a low rocky outcropping, and it diffused through the sand in a way that made the ground itself appear translucent, as if the desert had become a thin membrane stretched over something vast and luminous below. She called for her husband, Batu, who joined her at the door. He saw it too. They both stood transfixed, watching as the glow seemed to intensify and then fade, intensify and fade, in a slow rhythmic cycle. That was when they first heard the sound, a low hissing that seemed to come from beneath the earth itself. It was not the hiss of escaping steam or the warning of a serpent. Oyuna struggled to describe it to Dr. Vasilieva, finally settling on a comparison to the sound of sand being poured through a giant sieve, mixed with something organic, something that suggested breath moving through an inhuman throat. Their eldest son, Dorjurin, had awakened by this point, along with his two younger siblings. Against his parents' protests, the young man insisted on investigating. He was strong and fearless, the type of young man who had wrestled horses and hunted wolves alongside his father. He had never encountered anything in the desert that he could not face or understand. He took a herding staff and approached the glowing area cautiously, his parents and siblings watching from the doorway of the jur. Dorjurin later told Dr. Vasilieva that as he drew closer, the hissing sound grew louder, and the quality of the light changed. It became brighter, more focused, and he could feel a strange sensation in the air, a prickling across his skin that made his hair stand on end. The scientist in Dr. Vasilieva noted this detail with particular interest. Static electricity, she wrote in her field notes. The charge build up before a lightning strike. On night 1D1. The young man was within 5 meters of the outcropping when he made the decision that would mark him for life. He extended the wooden staff toward the area of brightest illumination, intending to probe the sand and see if something lay buried there. The moment the staff made contact with the glowing sand, Dorjurin's world exploded into white light and crushing force. The electrical discharge threw him backward nearly 3 meters. His parents described seeing a brilliant flash, brighter than the sun, that left afterimages dancing in their vision. The crack of the discharge was loud enough to echo off the distant hills. Dorjurin landed hard on his back, his hands still locked around the herding staff despite the shock, smoke rising from his clenched fists. The glow beneath the sand vanished instantly, as if a switch had been thrown. The hissing ceased, and in the sudden darkness and silence that followed, they heard something else. Movement. Something large displacing sand beneath the surface, traveling away from their camp at tremendous speed. Batu described it as similar to the sensation you feel through your feet when a heavy truck passes on a nearby road, a tremor through the earth itself, but moving in a direction, tracking away toward the east. The family rushed to Dorjurin, who was conscious but in severe pain. His hands were burned badly, the flesh marked with those distinctive branching patterns that Dr. Vasilieva would photograph weeks later. The wooden staff had been split lengthwise, as if struck by lightning, and the end that had touched the glowing sand was charred black. They tended to Dorjurin's burns as best they could through the remainder of the night, using traditional remedies of animal fat and herbs. When dawn finally came, Batu ventured out to investigate the site. The livestock had returned to normal, moving about and grazing as if nothing had happened, though several of the sheep appeared disoriented and confused. Near the outcropping where the glow had been strongest, Batu found the track. This detail, perhaps more than any other, convinced Dr. Vasilieva that the family was reporting something real, something that defied conventional explanation. The pattern in the sand was unlike any animal trail Batu had ever seen, and he had tracked everything from wolves to camels across the Gobi. The trail consisted of perfectly symmetrical ridges in the sand, each approximately as wide as a man's torso, running parallel to each other in sets of 3. The ridges showed a wave-like pattern, suggesting muscular undulation, the way a massive serpent might move. But the scale was all wrong for any known reptile. The trail extended from the rocky outcropping toward the east for nearly 200 meters before disappearing into harder ground where tracks could not form. Most disturbing was the depth and weight evident in the impressions. Whatever had made these tracks was massive and had been traveling beneath the surface of the sand, displacing it from below rather than crawling across the top. Batu measured the spacing and depth as best he could, reporting to Dr. Vasilieva that the creature, if that was what it was, must have been enormous, perhaps as thick as a well-fed horse and many meters in length. The family packed their belongings that same morning. They would not spend another night near those grounds. Oyuna told Dr. Vasilieva that she felt they had disturbed something ancient, something that had every right to the desert and did not welcome human presence. The electrical shock that injured their son was a warning, she believed, and she was not willing to risk what might happen if they ignored it. Dr. Vasileva's initial skepticism had been thoroughly challenged by the time she completed her interviews. She examined Dorjirin's hands extensively, photographing them from multiple angles and documenting the progression of healing. She consulted medical texts and corresponded with colleagues who specialized in electrical injuries. The burns were consistent with high-voltage electrical shock, the kind one might receive from industrial equipment or a lightning strike. But there had been no storm that night, no power lines for hundreds of kilometers, no explanation for such a discharge occurring naturally in the desert. The anthropologist also traveled to the abandoned campsite, though by the time she arrived in mid-September, wind and time had erased most of the unusual tracks. She found the split herding staff, which the family had left behind, and she collected samples of the charred wood for analysis. She photographed the area and interviewed neighboring families, some of whom reported seeing strange lights in that direction on the night in question, though they were too far away to have witnessed the encounter directly. In her final report, filed with the Mongolian Academy of Sciences and copied to her superiors in Leningrad, Dr. Vasilieva carefully avoided drawing definitive conclusions. She presented the testimony, the physical evidence, and her own observations, allowing the reader to make their own determination. But in her private journals, discovered years later, she wrote something more candid. "There are phenomena in this world," she noted, "that lie beyond our current understanding, things that exist in the spaces between scientific categories. And perhaps it is the height of arrogance to assume that we have cataloged every form of life that shares this planet with us." The Batsaikhan family never returned to their traditional summer grounds. Dorjirin's hands healed, but the scars remained, a permanent reminder of the night they encountered something that should not exist, something that moved beneath the sands of the Gobi with its own alien purpose, something that defended its territory with a force that nearly killed a young man whose only crime was curiosity. The heat in the Nemegt Basin was unlike anything the team had experienced before. It was the kind of heat that made the horizon shimmer and dance, that turned the Mongolian desert into a vast ocean of sand, stretching endlessly in every direction. In the summer of 1990, a group of researchers led by Czech cryptozoologist Ivan Makarla arrived in this remote corner of the Gobi Desert, with equipment that had never before been deployed in the search for legendary creatures. They came seeking the Mongolian Death Worm, a creature dismissed by mainstream science, yet deeply embedded in the folklore of the region. But what made this expedition different from countless others was Makarel's approach. He wasn't relying on eyewitness accounts or local guides alone. He was bringing technology. Ivan Makarel had spent years studying reports of the creature locals called Olgoi-Khorkhoi. He had interviewed nomadic herders, pored over historical accounts, and become convinced that if this creature existed, it would need to be documented using modern scientific equipment. His expedition team consisted of 7 members, including 2 technicians specializing in seismic monitoring, a thermal imaging specialist, and a documentary filmmaker armed with professional 16mm film cameras. They also brought something unprecedented to cryptozoological fieldwork: an array of vibration sensors designed to detect underground movement, the kind of equipment typically used in geological surveys and earthquake prediction. The logic was simple. If the death worm spent most of its life beneath the sand, as legend suggested, then it would create detectable vibrations when it moved through the substrate. The team established their base camp in a particularly desolate section of the Nomad Basin, an area where sightings had been reported with unusual frequency over the previous decade. The landscape was unforgiving. During the day, temperatures soared past 40 degrees Celsius, hot enough to make the metal equipment painful to touch. At night, the temperature could plummet 20 degrees or more, leaving the researchers shivering in their tents. Water was precious, transported in large containers that seemed to empty far too quickly. Sand got into everything despite their best efforts, jamming camera mechanisms, grinding between teeth, coating every surface with a fine, gritty layer that never seemed to disappear. But Mackerel drove his team forward with unwavering determination. The methodology was meticulous. They established a grid system covering roughly 3 square kilometers, placing vibration sensors at strategic intervals. These sensors were buried just beneath the surface, connected to a central monitoring station where 2 team members maintained a constant watch, recording data around the clock. The thermal imaging equipment was more mobile, scanning the sand for heat signatures that might indicate something large moving beneath the surface. They worked in shifts, with some team members monitoring equipment, while others conducted interviews with local herders and documented the environmental condition. Everything was recorded. Every reading was logged. Mackerel wanted documentation that could withstand scientific scrutiny. For the first 2 weeks, nothing unusual occurred. The sensors picked up occasional small vibrations from wind, from the researchers themselves moving about camp, and from what appeared to be small desert animals burrowing through the sand. The thermal cameras showed exactly what you would expect in a desert environment. Hot sand, cooler subsurface layers, and the occasional lizard or rodent. The monotony was broken only by dust storms that forced the team to secure their equipment and take shelter. Some team members began to question whether they were wasting their time in this hostile environment, chasing folklore with expensive equipment that would ultimately prove nothing. Then came July 23rd. The date would become central to one of the most controversial pieces of footage in cryptozoological history. It started just after noon, during the hottest part of the day when most of the team had retreated to the shade of their tents. 2 researchers were monitoring the sensor array when they noticed something irregular. The vibrations weren't random. They showed a pattern, a rhythm that suggested coordinated movement, rather than geological activity or wind effects. The readings indicated something large was moving through the sand approximately 50 meters from the main camp, perhaps 2 meters beneath the surface. The team mobilized with practiced efficiency, despite the heat. Cameras were grabbed, film loaded, equipment checked in seconds rather than minutes. The thermal imaging operator reported temperature anomalies consistent with the vibration readings. Something was displacing the sand, creating friction, generating heat. The documentary filmmaker, whose name was recorded as Petr Novak in the expedition logs, positioned himself with his 16mm camera aimed at the area where the sensors indicated the strongest activity. Other team members spread out with still cameras and handheld video equipment. Everyone was watching the sand, looking for any sign of movement, any indication that something beneath the surface was approaching. What happened next was captured on film, but the interpretation of that footage remains fiercely debated 3 decades later. According to the testimony of multiple expedition members, the air suddenly changed. Several researchers described feeling their hair standing on end, that distinctive sensation of static electricity building in the atmosphere. Electronic equipment began malfunctioning. One of the handheld video cameras simply died, its battery completely drained despite having been fresh that morning. A radio started emitting bursts of white noise. The thermal imaging equipment flickered and displayed error messages before stabilizing. Team members reported feeling disoriented, as if the pressure in the air had suddenly shifted. Some described a smell like ozone, that sharp metallic scent that accompanies electrical discharges. Then the sand erupted. Not explosively, but with an undulating motion that Mackerel himself later described as resembling water being displaced by something moving just beneath the surface. The 16mm camera was rolling, capturing approximately 4 seconds of footage that would be analyzed. enhanced, debated, and disputed for years to come. The film shows a rippling in the sand, a clear disturbance moving from left to right across the frame. Then something breaches the surface. Dark, thick, appearing segmented or ridged. It's visible for perhaps 2 seconds before withdrawing back beneath the sand with the same undulating motion. The entire event lasted no more than 4 seconds from initial disturbance to final disappearance. The immediate aftermath was chaos. Researchers were shouting, some running toward the spot where the object had breached, others checking their equipment to confirm what had been recorded. The vibration sensors had spiked dramatically during those few seconds, showing readings far beyond anything recorded previously. But just as suddenly as it began, everything stopped. The sensors returned to baseline. The static electricity dissipated. The sand settled back into its normal windswept patterns. When team members reached the location of the breach, they found the surface disturbed, but already being reshaped by wind. No clear tracks remained, no holes indicating where something had emerged or retreated. Just loose sand that revealed nothing definitive. The footage was carefully secured and transported back to Prague for analysis. This is where the story becomes as much about interpretation as observation. Believers in the footage's authenticity point to several factors. Multiple expedition members witnessed the event with their own eyes, not just through camera lenses. The sensor data corroborates the visual evidence, showing massive underground movement at precisely the moment the object breached. The electrical disturbances suggest something generating a significant electromagnetic field, consistent with some reports of the death worm's alleged abilities. The object in the footage appears to have mass and structure, moving in a way that seems biological rather than mechanical or atmospheric. Skeptics, however, have mounted equally compelling arguments. Some analysts suggest the footage shows nothing more than a localized sandstorm effect, a whirlwind or dust devil that would naturally create the undulating patterns visible in the film. The desert environment is known for creating unusual optical phenomena, mirages and distortions that can make ordinary events appear extraordinary. Others point to potential camera malfunction. The extreme heat and sand could have damaged the film or the camera mechanism itself, creating artifacts in the footage that were then misinterpreted as something anomalous. The 4-second duration is convenient, skeptics argue. Long enough to be intriguing, but too short for detailed analysis. Why did the object disappear so quickly? Why weren't subsequent searches able to locate it? The electrical disturbances have their own competing explanations. Desert environments can generate significant static electricity naturally, particularly during certain atmospheric conditions. Equipment failures in extreme heat are common and hardly require paranormal explanations. The ozone smell could result from overheating electronic components rather than any creature's biological processes. The vibration sensors, while showing unusual readings, might have detected geological activity unrelated to any living creature. Small earthquakes, subsurface air pockets collapsing, thermal expansion of rock layers beneath the sand, all could create the patterns recorded that day. Enhanced analysis of the footage has provided ammunition for both sides. Frame-by-frame examination shows what appears to be a solid object displacing sand, but the resolution of 16mm film from that era has limitations. Digital enhancement can only reveal so much before you're essentially looking at interpretations of pixels rather than clear evidence. Some analysts claim to see segmentation in the object, ridges or plates that would be consistent with descriptions of the death worm. Others see nothing but sand and shadow, arguing that human pattern recognition is imposing structure where none exists. It's a cryptozoological Rorschach test, with people seeing what they expect or want to see. The testimony of expedition members adds another layer to the mystery. Over the years, their accounts have remained remarkably consistent, which believers cite as evidence of reliability. They describe the same electrical sensations, the same visual observations, the same sense that something genuinely unusual occurred that July afternoon. But skeptics note that group psychology and shared expectations can create false consensus. If everyone on the expedition believed they were hunting a real creature, they were primed to interpret ambiguous events as confirmation of that belief. Memory is also unreliable, particularly for brief, chaotic events. What people remember happening and what actually happened can diverge significantly over time. Mackerlin himself defended the footage until his death in 2014, insisting that his team had documented something genuinely anomalous in the Gobi Desert that day. He acknowledged that the footage alone couldn't prove the existence of the Mongolian Death Worm, but argued it was sufficient evidence to warrant further investigation with even more sophisticated equipment. He planned subsequent expeditions, but was never able to match the funding or logistics of the 1990 trip. The footage remains his expedition's primary legacy, endlessly debated in cryptozoological circles and dismissed by mainstream zoologists who see nothing worthy of serious scientific attention. What makes the mackerel footage so compelling isn't necessarily what it shows, but what it represents. It's the eternal tension between belief and skepticism, between the desire for mystery in our increasingly mapped and documented world, and the scientific demand for reproducible evidence. 4 seconds of 16mm film, shot in extreme conditions, showing something that might be extraordinary, or might be completely mundane. In those 4 seconds, we see reflected our own relationship with the unknown. Some of us see wonder and possibility. Others see the human capacity for self-deception. And perhaps that says more about us than it does about what may or may not be moving beneath the sands of the Gobi Desert. The Gobi Desert stretches across the border between Mongolia and China like a vast ocean of stone and sand, holding secrets beneath its surface that have remained buried for millions of years. In 2003, a Chinese copper mining operation established itself in this remote wilderness, approximately 60 kilometers from the Mongolian frontier. The men who worked there came for the promise of steady wages in a region where opportunities were scarce. They descended into the earth daily, carving tunnels through ancient rock, pulling copper ore from veins that snaked through the darkness. What they found instead, on the night of September 14th, would challenge everything investigators thought they understood about industrial accidents. The night shift began at 2200 hours like any other. 12 men reported for duty that evening, their headlamps cutting through the perpetual twilight of the mining camp. The temperature above ground had dropped to near freezing, but hundreds of meters below, the tunnels maintained a constant temperature that made the work bearable. 3 of those men, Zhang Wei, Liu Hao, and Chen Ming, were assigned to Shaft 7, a newly excavated section that had only been operational for 6 weeks. The shift supervisor, a veteran miner named Wu Jianping, would later testify that nothing seemed unusual when he conducted his initial rounds at 23:30 hours. The equipment functioned normally. The men appeared in good spirits. The geological surveys had shown stable rock formations, with no indication of gas pockets or structural weaknesses. At approximately 01:15 hours, Wu Jianping heard what he initially thought was a hydraulic line rupturing. He described it in his official statement as a sound unlike anything he had encountered in 22 years of mining work. It was a hissing that seemed to carry an electrical quality, a static-laden serpentine whisper that echoed through the tunnels in a way that made his skin crawl. The sound originated from Shaft 7. Wu grabbed his radio and attempted to contact the 3 workers stationed there. He received no response. Following standard emergency protocols, he gathered 2 other miners and descended into the tunnel, carrying gas detectors and emergency breathing apparatus. What they discovered defied immediate explanation. The 3 workers lay within 50 meters of each other, positioned in a rough semicircle around a section of tunnel wall that had partially collapsed. Zhang Wei was closest to the collapse, his body contorted in a position that suggested he had died trying to crawl away from something. Liu Hao had made it approximately 20 meters further before collapsing near a support beam. Chen Ming had reached the farthest point, but whatever had killed the others had caught him as well. Wu Jianping later told investigators that the scene reminded him of people fleeing from something they could not outrun. The bodies themselves presented a horrifying tableau that would haunt the first responders for years to come. All 3 men showed signs of severe electrical trauma. Their skin displayed the characteristic fern-like patterns of Lichtenberg figures, the branching burns that occur when high-voltage electricity courses through human tissue. These patterns covered their arms, necks, and faces in delicate, terrible detail. But the gas detectors showed no explosive gases, no electrical short circuits, nothing that could account for electrocution of this magnitude. The nearest power source was over 100 meters away, and all electrical systems in Shaft 7 were functioning normally. There was simply no mechanism that could have delivered such a massive electrical charge to 3 men simultaneously. More disturbing still were the chemical burns. Forensic pathologists who later examined the bodies identified corrosive damage, consistent with exposure to a powerful acid or alkaline substance. The burns appeared on their hands, faces, and any exposed skin, eating through the outer layers of tissue in irregular patches. Samples taken from the victim's skin and clothing showed trace amounts of an organic compound that the laboratory technicians could not definitively identify. The substance shared characteristics with certain enzymatic digestive fluids, but the molecular structure contained elements that didn't match any known biological secretion. One pathologist noted in the leaked internal report that the compound seemed designed to break down organic matter with remarkable efficiency, similar to the digestive systems of certain deep-sea creatures or carrion beetles, but far more concentrated. Wu Jianping's testimony provided the most chilling element of the incident. As he approached the collapse site with his 2 companions, his headlamp illuminated something moving near the broken tunnel wall. He described it as a rope-like entity, approximately as thick as a man's thigh, that seemed to possess a disturbing fluidity of movement. It was emerging from or retreating into the collapsed section. He couldn't determine which. The surface appeared segmented, almost scaled, with a coloration he struggled to describe. In his initial statement, he called it gray-green. In later interviews, he amended this to something closer to the color of tarnished copper with hints of bioluminescence, a faint glow that pulsed irregularly along its length. The entity moved with purpose, not the random writhing of a severed cable or pneumatic hose. Wu Jianping emphasized this point repeatedly during his interviews. It moved like something aware, something alive. The hissing static sound intensified as his light fell upon it, reaching a pitch that caused actual physical pain in his ears. One of the miners accompanying Wu vomited inside his helmet. The other turned and ran, screaming into his radio for evacuation. Wu Jianping stood frozen, watching as the rope-like form withdrew into the collapse with shocking speed, vanishing into a gap in the rock face that appeared far too small to accommodate its mass. The company response began within hours. Senior management from the regional office arrived by helicopter at dawn on September 15. The bodies were removed from the mine and transported to a facility in Hohhot, the capital of Inner Mongolia. The families of the deceased were told their relatives had died in a methane explosion, a tragic but comprehensible industrial accident. They received compensation packages that were unusually generous by regional standards, contingent upon signing non-disclosure agreements. The other 9 miners on duty that night were transferred to different facilities, scattered across 3 provinces. Wu Jianping received a promotion and a posting to an administrative role in Beijing, effectively removing him from the mining operation entirely. Shaft 7 was sealed within 72 hours of the incident. The official explanation cited geological instability and the risk of further collapses. Concrete barriers were erected, and that entire section of the mine was declared off-limits. Security personnel were stationed at the access points with instructions that emphasized the structural dangers of entering the sealed area. The investigation that followed was conducted entirely by company personnel and private contractors. Local authorities were told the matter had been resolved internally and no criminal negligence had been found. The deaths were ruled accidental, caused by equipment failure and subsequent methane ignition. This explanation satisfied no one who had seen the bodies or heard the testimony of the survivors, but it became the official record nonetheless. The internal investigation report that eventually leaked to mining safety advocates in 2007 painted a very different picture. This document, authenticated by multiple sources and verified against company records, revealed that sensors installed throughout Shaft 7 had detected unusual seismic activity in the minutes before and after the deaths. The disturbance originated near the collapse site and moved through the rock in a pattern that suggested a single object traveling through the earth itself. The speed was calculated at approximately 15 kilometers per hour, sustained for nearly 40 minutes before the signature faded beyond the range of the sensors. This was not an earthquake or routine settling of geological strata. Something had moved through solid rock at a speed that defied conventional understanding. chemical analysis included in a leaked report detailed the unknown organic compound found on the victims. The substance showed signs of being enzymatically active, meaning it was produced by a biological organism rather than being a mineral or synthetic chemical. Spectrographic analysis revealed trace elements common in deep geological formations, suggesting the source organism existed in an environment far below normal mining depths. One researcher noted that certain extremophile organisms discovered in deep ocean thermal vents shared some characteristics with the unknown compound, but the similarity was superficial at best. Whatever produced this substance represented an entirely different category of life. Perhaps most disturbing was a brief section of the report that documented previous incidents. 3 other deaths had occurred in the 2 years since the mine began operations. Each was attributed to different causes: 1 rockfall, 1 equipment malfunction, 1 unexplained cardiac arrest. But when examined together, a pattern emerged. All 3 previous deaths occurred in sections of the mine that were later closed for various officially stated reasons. All 3 victims showed minor chemical burns that were not adequately explained by the official cause of death. And in 2 cases, other workers reported hearing unusual sounds in the hours before the fatalities, sounds they described as hissing, grinding, or something moving through solid rock. The leaked report concluded with a recommendation that shocked those who read it. The investigators suggested that the mine had inadvertently breached a previously unknown ecosystem, existing deep within the geological strata. They theorized that certain organisms adapted to extreme environments. Organisms that had evolved in isolation for potentially millions of years might possess defensive or predatory capabilities that appeared anomalous by surface standards. The term they used was unknown biological hazard, deliberately vague language that avoided making claims that would seem too extraordinary for a corporate document. The recommendation was to halt all deep excavation immediately and consult with specialists in extremophile biology and deep earth ecology. This recommendation was not implemented. Instead, the company adjusted its mining operations to avoid certain depths and geological formations, unofficial changes that were never documented in public records. Wu Jianping gave one final interview in 2009 to a mining industry safety publication. He spoke carefully, clearly aware of the legal and professional consequences of violating his non-disclosure agreement, but he emphasized certain points. He stated that mining operations worldwide were pushing into depths and environments that humanity had never accessed before. He suggested that the assumption that deep rock formations are sterile, lifeless environments might be fundamentally incorrect, and he warned that industrial accidents could take forms that current safety protocols were not designed to address. When asked directly about the incident in 2003, he declined to provide details, but stated simply that some things exist beyond the range of human experience until we intrude into their domain. Then they become our problem, whether we understand them or not. The mine continues to operate today, though Shaft 7 remains sealed behind concrete and warning signs. The deaths are remembered in the region as a tragedy, though the details have been obscured by time and official narratives. The families received their compensation and signed their agreements, and the truth became another buried thing in a landscape full of buried things. In the vast emptiness of Mongolia's Unsolved province, where the Gobi Desert stretches beyond the limits of human comprehension, there exists a place now marked with warning signs that few tourists ever see. The coordinates are deliberately kept from public maps. Local guides refuse to speak its name after dark. And somewhere beneath those endless dunes, a story remains buried that challenges everything we think we know about what lurks in remote places. Hans Müller was 34 years old in the spring of 2011, a high school geography teacher from Stuttgart with an infectious enthusiasm for wild places. His colleagues described him as meticulous, the kind of person who triple-checked his equipment and always filed detailed itineraries before any trip. He had spent 2 years planning his Mongolian adventure, learning basic phrases in the language, studying geological formations, and corresponding with local guides about the safest routes through the southern desert regions. His preparation was exhaustive. His caution was legendary among his fellow travelers. None of it would matter. Müller arrived in Dalanzadgad, the capital of Gobi province, on March 14, 2011. He hired an experienced guide named Batar, a man who had led tourists through the Gobi for over 15 years without incident. The plan was straightforward, a 5-day journey through the southern reaches of the province, visiting fossil beds and ancient rock formations, staying close to established routes, maintaining radio contact with the guide service every evening. It was the kind of trip Batar had conducted dozens of times before. The first 3 days proceeded exactly as planned. Mueller's journal entries, later recovered, document his wonder at the landscape with the precision of a trained educator. He wrote about the quality of light at dawn, the geological stratification visible in exposed cliff faces, the unexpected resilience of desert plant life. He photographed extensively, filling memory cards with images of rock formations, distant mountains, the play of shadows across sand. His entries revealed a man completely in his element, experiencing exactly the adventure he had dreamed about for years. On March 18th, the 4th day of the expedition, Mueller asked Batar if they could deviate slightly from their planned route. He had spotted what he thought might be an interesting geological formation, approximately 3 kilometers to the east of their position. Batar was initially hesitant, but the detour seemed minor. The weather was clear, and Mueller's excitement was persuasive. They agreed that Mueller would take his vehicle to investigate and photograph the formation, while Batar remained at their camp to prepare the evening meal. Mueller would take his satellite phone, his GPS unit, and would return within 2 hours. It was just after 3 in the afternoon when he drove away, his hand raised in a casual wave that Batar would replay in his mind countless times in the years that followed. 2 hours passed. Then, 3. Batar tried the satellite phone repeatedly, receiving only silence. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the desert in shades of copper and blood, he made the decision to contact the guide service and request immediate assistance. By nightfall, a search team was mobilizing. By dawn, they were scouring the desert. They found Mueller's vehicle 18 hours after he had driven away from camp. It sat in a shallow depression between 2 low dunes, perfectly upright, doors closed, engine cold. There was no sign of a struggle, no indication of mechanical failure. The keys were still in the ignition. Mueller's water bottles sat in the cup holders, half full. His satellite phone lay on the passenger seat, fully charged but somehow non-functional, as if its internal components had simply ceased to operate. What struck the search team immediately was the area surrounding the vehicle. The sand for roughly 30 meters in every direction appeared unnaturally smooth, almost glassy in texture. O'Keefe, one of the lead searchers, later described it in his official report as looking like someone had taken a massive iron to the desert floor. The normal ripples and patterns created by wind were completely absent. The sand had been compressed into something approaching a solid surface, hard enough that it barely took footprints. In his testimony to local authorities, O'Keefe stated that in 23 years of desert search and rescue operations, he had never encountered terrain that looked or felt like what surrounded Mueller's abandoned vehicle. Mueller's belongings were scattered in a rough circle around the car, but the pattern made no sense. His backpack lay approximately 15 meters to the north, its contents carefully arranged on the sand as if on display. Water purification tablets, a first aid kit, energy bars, a paperback novel, sunscreen. His hat was found 20 meters to the east, placed deliberately on top of a small rock. His sunglasses sat folded on the hood of the vehicle. None of these items showed any damage. They had not been thrown or dropped. They had been positioned. The search team worked in expanding spirals from the vehicle, looking for any sign of Mueller himself. They found nothing. No footprints leading away. No indication of where he might have gone or why he would have left the relative safety of his vehicle. The desert had simply swallowed him whole. It was Tuya, the team's technical specialist, who first noticed the chemical anomaly. She had brought a portable soil analysis kit, standard equipment for desert searches where contamination from fuel spills or chemical leaks might indicate an accident. The readings she obtained from the smooth sand surrounding the vehicle made no sense. She ran the tests 3 times, certain her equipment was malfunctioning. The soil showed elevated levels of sodium chloride far beyond what would occur naturally in this region, along with traces of calcium sulfate and something she initially thought might be magnesium carbonate. But the concentrations were wrong. The distribution patterns were uniform rather than natural. and the chemical signature didn't match any industrial or geological process she was familiar with. In her official report, she noted simply that the findings were anomalous and recommended further investigation by geochemical specialists. It was on the second day of the search that Javelin, a younger member of the team, noticed something unusual. The sun was at a particular angle in the late afternoon, and a small section of the smooth sand appeared to reflect light differently than the surrounding area. The team began to dig carefully at that spot, expecting perhaps to find a buried piece of equipment or a clue to Mueller's disappearance. What they found instead was Mueller's camera, a professional-grade digital SLR, buried exactly 3 feet beneath the surface. The camera was completely undamaged. Not a scratch on the lens, no sand inside the body or mechanism. It had been buried carefully, perhaps even lovingly, wrapped in what appeared to be fragments of Mueller's own shirt. But when they attempted to turn it on, nothing happened. The battery, which should have retained at least some charge, was completely and utterly drained. Not low, not depleted through normal use, but drained so thoroughly that when later examined by electronic specialists in Ulaanbaatar, they found the battery cells had been stressed in a way inconsistent with normal discharge patterns. The memory card, however, was intact. It contained 147 photographs from Mueller's trip. 146 of them showed exactly what you would expect: landscapes, rock formations, the play of light across sand, the occasional self-portrait of a smiling man living his dream. The final photograph, image number 147, was different. The metadata embedded in the file indicated it had been taken at 5:27 in the afternoon on March 18, 2011, approximately 2 hours after Mueller had left Batar at their camp, roughly 90 minutes before sunset. The photograph appeared to show a section of empty desert, taken from a low angle as if Mueller had been crouching or kneeling when he triggered the shutter. The foreground was sharp and clear: disturbed sand, scattered pebbles, the edge of what might have been Mueller's own boot visible at the bottom right corner of the frame. But in the middle distance, approximately 40 to 50 meters from the camera's position, there was something else. A shape, partially visible above the sand, partially submerged beneath it. The color was wrong, a reddish tone that didn't match anything else in the frame, not the golden sand, or the blue sky, or the distant purple mountains. The texture was wrong too, even in the original, unenhanced image. It appeared organic, but not in any way that made sense. Not skin, not fabric, not stone. Something that suggested a surface both wet and dry, smooth and textured, living and utterly dead. The photograph was later subjected to extensive analysis by image enhancement specialists in 3 different countries. What they discovered raised more questions than it answered. When the image was enlarged and contrast enhanced, the shape revealed what might have been a complex geometric structure: angles that didn't quite obey normal perspective, surfaces that seemed to shift depending on which enhancement algorithm was applied. Some analysts reported seeing what looked like patterns reminiscent of cellular structures magnified thousands of times. Others claimed the shape suggested something architectural, deliberately constructed. No 2 experts could agree on exactly what the photograph actually showed. Dr. Elena Rostova, a forensic image analyst from Moscow who spent 6 weeks studying the photograph, published a brief paper noting that certain aspects of the image were inconsistent with the camera's known optical characteristics. The depth of field was wrong. The way light fell on the reddish shape didn't match the angle of the sun based on the timestamp and GPS coordinates. It was, she wrote, as if the shape existed slightly outside the normal photographic plane, as if the camera had somehow captured something that wasn't entirely present in 3-dimensional space at the moment the shutter clicked. The most disturbing detail emerged only after extreme magnification of a specific section of the photograph. In the lower portion of the partially visible shape, there appeared to be something that multiple analysts described, with obvious reluctance, as resembling human fingers. Not attached to a hand, not part of a recognizable human form, but fingers nonetheless. 5 of them, pressed against or possibly emerging from the reddish surface, positioned in a way that suggested either reaching or pushing. The search for Hans Mueller continued for 11 days. Teams covered hundreds of square kilometers. Helicopters equipped with thermal imaging swept the region. Ground-penetrating radar was brought in to scan the area where his vehicle had been found. They discovered nothing. No body. No additional evidence. No explanation for the smooth sand, the chemical anomalies, or the buried camera. On March 30th, 2011, the official search was suspended. Mueller was declared missing, presumed dead, though no death certificate could be issued without remains. In the months that followed, there were attempts to investigate further. A geological team from the University of Ulaanbaatar visited the site in June of 2011 to study the soil anomalies. They reported that the chemical signatures Tuya had detected were still present but fading, as if whatever had caused them was slowly dissipating or being absorbed deeper into the earth. They also noted that the unnaturally smooth sand had begun to develop normal wind patterns again, though the process seemed slower than it should have been, as if the desert itself was reluctant to reclaim that particular piece of ground. A second expedition, this one privately funded by Mueller's family, attempted to reach the site in October of 2012. They were turned back by local authorities, who had by then officially designated the area as dangerous and off-limits to civilian traffic. The stated reason was unexploded ordnance from historical military exercises, though no records exist of any such exercises ever taking place in that region. The real reason, according to testimony from one of the local officials who spoke anonymously to a German journalist in 2014, was that the area had been deemed psychologically hazardous based on reports from the search teams who had experienced recurring nightmares and psychological distress after spending time at the site. Hans Mueller's body has never been recovered. The final photograph from his camera has been analyzed, debated, and studied, but no consensus has emerged about what it actually shows. The area where he disappeared remains officially restricted, marked on local maps with symbols that don't appear in any standard cartographic legend. Guides in Dalanzadgad will not discuss the case with tourists, and mention of Mueller's name in certain establishments will result in a polite but firm request to change the subject. Batar, the guide who last saw Mueller alive, gave only one interview about the incident, in 2013. He told the interviewer that sometimes, late at night, he still thinks about the wave Mueller gave him as he drove away toward the eastern horizon. He said he dreams about that moment, except in the dreams Mueller is waving goodbye, not with his hand raised in casual farewell, but with all 5 fingers pressed flat against an invisible surface, as if pushing against glass, as if trying to warn him about something on the other side that Batar could not see. The restricted zone remains. The photograph remains. And somewhere beneath the shifting sands of the Gobi province, something else remains too, waiting in the place where a geography teacher from Stuttgart took his last photograph and stepped across a threshold from which there is no return. The Mongolian death worm has never been captured. Not once. Not in over 60 years of documented searches, scientific expeditions, and local encounters. This simple fact should settle the matter, should relegate the creature to the realm of folklore and superstition. But the evidence refuses to cooperate with such comfortable conclusions. 6 separate incidents, spanning from 1947 to 2009, describe encounters with something in the Gobi Desert that matches no known species. Multiple witnesses, many of them unconnected, separated by decades and hundreds of miles, yet their descriptions align with disturbing precision. Physical evidence collected from alleged encounter sites shows chemical compositions that defy standard biological explanation. And then there are the electromagnetic readings, consistently appearing in reports where they have no logical reason to exist. The scientific community prefers silence on this matter. The Mongolian government has quietly restricted access to certain coordinates in the southern Gobi, offering no official explanation for zones that were previously open to nomadic herders and researchers alike. These are not protected archaeological sites. No endangered species listings justify the barriers. The restrictions simply appeared, enforced by officials who declined to discuss their purpose. Consider the evidence as it exists, stripped of sensationalism and folklore embellishment. In 1992, a geological survey team documented electrical interference with their equipment in a region where such anomalies had no precedent. The interference followed a pattern, rhythmic and regular, before ceasing entirely. 3 members of that team reported seeing movement beneath the sand approximately 40 meters from their position. The surface undulated, they claimed, as though something large traveled just below. When they investigated, they found the sand disturbed in a channel, roughly 1 meter wide, extending for nearly 20 meters. The sand itself, when analyzed later, showed unusual heat signatures and trace chemical residues that included compounds typically associated with electrical discharge and organic tissue breakdown. No samples of tissue were recovered. No physical remains have ever been found. This absence haunts every investigation. How does a creature of the reported size, living in a harsh environment with limited resources, leave no trace beyond these ephemeral signs? How does it avoid detection by satellite imagery, thermal sensors, and the constant presence of human activity across even the most remote desert regions? One possibility circles back through the reports with unsettling consistency: electroreception. Deep-sea organisms navigate lightless waters using electrical fields. Certain fish generate powerful shocks for hunting and defense. Could something analogous exist beneath the Gobi sands? Could an organism adapted to subterranean life in mineral-rich soil develop extraordinary electrical capabilities? The chemical burns documented in several encounter reports match no known biological toxin, but they do share characteristics with electrical burns and certain forms of chemical corrosion. Witnesses describe a sensation of static electricity before encounters, a prickling of the skin and standing of hair that suggests electromagnetic fields in flux. The theoretical biology becomes more plausible when considering the Gobi's unique composition. The desert floor contains unusual concentrations of specific minerals and metallic compounds. Water, when present in underground aquifers, could conduct electrical current through layers of sand and stone. An organism evolved to exploit these conditions might develop sensory and defensive capabilities unlike anything in the established zoological record. It might detect vibrations and electromagnetic signatures from great distances. It might generate defensive electrical discharges powerful enough to deter predators or kill prey. It might leave behind exactly the kind of evidence we find: heat distortion, chemical residue, electromagnetic anomalies, and witnesses with burns that mystify medical analysis. But this remains speculation, theory constructed to explain observations that shouldn't exist. Without a specimen, without conclusive physical proof, the scientific method reaches an impasse. The absence of evidence, in this case, is not evidence of absence. Too many reliable witnesses, too many trained observers, too many independent incidents separated by time and geography, all pointing towards something that persists in the deep places of the Gobi. And then there is 2023. Seismic monitoring stations positioned across the southern Gobi to study geological activity began registering unusual readings in previously quiet zones. The vibrations appeared rhythmic, occurring in patterns that matched no known geological phenomena. Earthquakes produce specific signatures. Wind and sand movement create recognizable patterns. Meteorological events have distinct characteristics. These vibrations matched none of those profiles. The readings continued for several weeks, appearing at irregular intervals, always in the same general region, always following that strange rhythmic pattern. Then they stopped as suddenly as they began. Research teams requested access to investigate. Those requests were denied without explanation. The restricted zones expanded. The official silence deepened. What moves beneath the Gobi sands in patterns that seismic instruments detect but cannot classify? What generates electromagnetic fields in a desert where such phenomena have no conventional source? What causes chemical burns matching no catalog toxin and leaves behind only questions? Perhaps the most disturbing possibility is not that the death worm exists, but that we lack the framework to understand what it might be. Our categories of life, our taxonomic systems, our understanding of biological possibility, all emerged from studying organisms in accessible environments. We know the forests, the ocean's surfaces, the mountains and plains. But the deep desert, the layers of sand and stone that shift and settle over millennia, those realms remain largely unexplored. We assume we know what can and cannot survive there. That assumption may be our greatest blindness. The restricted zones continue to expand. The seismic readings remain unexplained in official records. Witnesses still report encounters, though fewer speak publicly now, aware that their testimony invites ridicule or unwanted attention from authority. The chemical samples sit in storage facilities, analyzed and reanalyzed, their composition stubbornly refusing to align with known biological processes. We are left with questions that have no comfortable answers. The evidence suggests something exists. The absence of specimens suggests we cannot find it, or perhaps that it does not wish to be found. In the deep sands of the Gobi, in places where human presence remains temporary and vulnerable, perhaps some ancient things persist, adapted to conditions we barely comprehend, waiting in the darkness beneath our feet. That's where this journey ends for tonight. If you made it all the way here, subscribe and hit the bell for more long-form stories like this. Check out the videos on screen for more right now. Drop your own experiences in the comments below. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.